So, you're a business owner dedicated to the significant and sustainable growth of both you and your business. Welcome to the Add a Zero podcast.
Welcome to the 100th episode of the Add a Zero Accidental Business Owner podcast. I'm Jay Allen, your host, and today is a milestone well worth celebrating, having got to our 100th episode. And to do so, I'm joined by not just a guest or even a special guest, but somebody that I've held in incredibly high regard for as long as I've known his story. I first met today's guest back in 2017 at a private event hosted by Smith & Williamson in London, where he shared a stage with then a very young Stephen Bartlett. They spoke candidly at the time about money and mindset and the realities of building something from scratch. That same evening, my TrueNORTH were honoured to be added to the Clear Business Thinking Power 100 list for ethics and transparency in business. Our guest launched a bold new concept in dining by borrowing £150,000 against his own home and then building it into a multi-nine-figure global brand. As one of the original dragons on BBC's Dragon's Den, I believe that this guest has helped shape the public conversation around entrepreneurship as it is today. In this episode, we'll explore the story behind Yo Sushi, his time as a dragon, and the advice he has for those starting out in business today. I'm thrilled to be able to welcome to the show none other than Mr. Simon Woodroffe OBE. Simon, good day to you.
Hello, Jay, and congratulations. I'm very honoured to be your 100th guest.
I couldn't think of anybody else that would fit the mould quite as well as you do, particularly on having gone from startup at the very start of your career and built something that is now a global brand as opposed to just a British brand. And I'm delighted and thrilled that you've agreed to be able to join us from your home in Thailand to be able to share your story today, sir. Simon, you've had a truly unconventional journey, I think is fair to say, from a roadie and a stage designer in the early days, all the way through to not just entrepreneur, but serial entrepreneur. Did you have any early experiences that shaped your entrepreneurial mindset?
Yeah, but before I do that, what you said in the introduction is absolutely right. I was there in 1997 when we launched Yo, and it was, the celebrity chefs had their go, and suddenly entrepreneurs had gone from being, the Spivvy or the Cufflinks or whatever, a lot of respected Richard Branson, and had become the new cool thing. And I rode that wave, and I think that is right. That period was a transformative period.
Yeah.
What was the way I see it, the early days, is that there was some grit in my oyster. What was the grit in my oyster growing up? Not an easy childhood, a military father and a lovely mother, but very, very emotional. And we were the poor relations in my mother's very extended family, so we went and stayed in these great houses and this, that, and the other. But we did, an army salary, and my father was always worried about money, and those things sort of contrived to. And my father was also a big sort of show off. He was one of those military guys who used to, when he retired, he wore sort of a big handkerchief out of his pocket, and it was all like this. And I figured that, if that's what he did, I'd sort of copy him. So I became a bit of a show off, but it was really, I think, as I grew up and left school, I went to a boarding school from a very young age, not easy. And as I grew up, that was the grit in the oyster that made me want to go out and be one of them. And famously, I used to tell people I was going to be a millionaire by the time I was 20. And then, of course, we got into our 20s, and it was love and peace back in the 60s and the early 70s. And I thought, and when we got to Yo eventually, which is further down the line in the story, that was the moment I thought to myself, I have, sort of tear your hair out, but I've completely forgotten to be a millionaire. And I think that drive from way back when came out and got me going.
Fascinating. Interestingly enough, I make comparisons, if you like, as you're sharing your story. My mother worked in public sector and my father ran his own small business, and continually seeing that almost that unintentional competition between the two of them, that mum had a really good salary from public sector and working in local government, and dad just seeing the need to be able to work every hour God sends to try and keep up with the salary and the expectation and the parties and the show. And as a result of that, you almost saw this employee-employer battle going on at the dining room table that said, well, I can see as to the struggle, but the reward from both angles. And therefore, perhaps that's something that's sown within both of us that then sets the stall out for what is to come.
And interestingly, that every one of your audience listening today has got some backstory like that, perhaps not put as eloquently as you just put yours, but we are behind each one of our masks. There's a complex story, and when you think that that's going on all over the world constantly, it's not surprising that the world is a complex place. So coming to terms, I think for the audience, you're coming to terms with what did happen to you as you grew up and what were your sort of driving things. A pretty useful thing to know.
Absolutely so, and ironically tapping into that and saying it doesn't have to be the narrative. There's a lovely quote from Maya Angelou that says, "It's no one's fault to be born poor. It's always your fault if you die poor." And it's about being able to analyze that narrative within us, isn't it? To understand as to, is this serving me, and if not, where else do I need to look for one that does?
Yeah, how can I step out of it?
Yes, absolutely so. Simon, you launched Yo Sushi with pretty much little or no experience in commercial hospitality. I'm intrigued to learn, why did you pick hospitality? What gave you the confidence to take that particular leap?
Well, what do you do when you've been a roadie and a stage designer and a television producer and selling rock music TVs around the world, and every time you've changed what you've done, you've been in the wilderness for a year and sort of rocking about thinking, what am I going to do next? And each time sort of nearly running out of money and 2 O levels, so nothing to fall back on. What do you do when you've got to the age of 45 and you can't think of anything else to do? Like a lot of people, you think, I've eaten in a lot of restaurants, I could do better than that. And I think that was part of it. But the other part was, I had been in the wilderness, as depressed and down, and what the hell am I going to do? And what I did realize through that haze is that sitting around thinking about it wasn't going to get me very far, but getting the sort of antenna out and getting out of the front door and seeing people and calling people, and I determined is the way forward. It was the way out of that hole, put it that way. And I determined to go out and see people, even people I was a bit scared of, and talk to them. And one of them was a guy called Mr. Uehara, who is from Fuji Sankei Television in Japan, who I'd known from the TV business. He's actually a producer of Japanese version of what was then Top of the Pops, which was called Hit Studio Deluxe. Not a lot of people know that about Japan. And anyway, this pre-internet, anybody knowing anything about Japan, really, it was a mystery of the East, last mystery of the East. I called up Mr. Uehara and said, look, I always admired you and respected you for what you've done. I'd love some advice on what I could do next. And he very kindly said, come and have lunch with me. And he took me out to a rather good Japanese restaurant in Berkeley Square, and we sat having lunch. And he was saying, well, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I've got to do something, and I want to start a new business. I don't think I'm employable, that's for sure. And I said, what about sushi? I'd always loved sushi. And, we were sitting eating sushi. I said, what about sushi? And there was this sort of Japanese silence, as he considered that sentence. And then out of the blue, he looked up at me And he said, what you should do, Simon, is a conveyor belt sushi bar with girls in black PVC miniskirts. And that's really what he said. In that sort of moment, I thought, wow. And of course, you can't research that without the internet and all of that. I asked him a bit more, and I thought, maybe this is what I'm going to do. And so I went out, and after some rather fruitless calls to the Japanese commercial embassy, a bit like sort of one of them calling our embassy and saying, how do I get the paper for fish and chips? I made some what felt like very expensive phone calls pre-WhatsApp, and I found out that I actually found out there were 2,500 of these conveyor belt sushi bars in Japan. They've been going since the 1960s, and then one day I got a brochure which was sort of in rather bad English, through the post of my little West London flat. And at the top it said how to start your own conveyor belt sushi bar. And it had names and contacts and phone numbers and sources and everything you needed to do. And I remember holding this piece of, it's like sort of, I don't know, pick this up. It's like holding this a brochure like this. And I thought to myself, my God, I hope nobody else has seen this, And then when that sort of euphoria of having hit on an idea, I'd calmed down. I thought to myself, I've got to get that together. And Felix Dennis, who I'm fond of quoting, who's a publisher, very successful businessman, wrote a book called How to Get Rich. He also wrote a poem. The first line is, ideas, we've had them since Eve first met Adam, but take it from me, execution's the key. So I went out to see if I could put this together. And of course, it was a good idea. It hadn't been done, hadn't been come out of Japan, conveyor belt sushi. But there's a sort of voice in the back of your head. I'm sure nobody else gets that, but I have a voice in the back of my head that says, look, if this was any good, somebody who knew a great deal more about restaurants than you, Simon, would have done this years ago. Unfortunately, I've been around long enough in this old world to know it's a delusion, but it took quite a while to kind of build up and know enough about it and go to Japan and do it until I had the new voice, which eventually arrived, which was, you're going to be very, very rich and very, very famous and very successful. And as I say, at least I was mature enough to know that both of them are delusion and actually hard work. Good fortune. The truth is, the harder you work, the more that you sweat, the luckier you get. And that's what happened.
There's so much I'd like to pick out of that, if I may, please. You've mentioned, a variety of different careers that Yo Sushi actually didn't take off and build until your mid-40s. And I think for anyone and everyone watching or listening to this, that there's an importance to understand that everything that you've done that's led you to where you are today has led you to where you are today, and yet it doesn't have to define where you then subsequently go off and do from tomorrow. The importance of being able to acknowledge transferable skills from one relationship or one experience or one connection, and then say, and how do I drag and bring that with me in order to do whatever it is that I want and choose to do next?
Yeah. The modern day version of that is, what are your skill sets? But I'm not sort of that process driven in terms of writing down those skill sets. But what I do know is that I was lucky enough to leave school with just 2 O-levels. So I never had the imagination educated out of me. So I had that sort of fertile imagination, which was how I became a stage designer, really. I got a big break doing a big Rod Stewart show, the first sort of big show that he wanted to go on tour with. And I worked in the theatre, so I knew a bit about design and all of that, and so I had that creative side. But then I'd been in the television business actually, and more on the kind of distribution and sales and contracts around the world of selling these TV rights, mostly to rock shows. And so I had the 2 things. I had a business side and had run small businesses that knew that running out of money was really what it was all about, or not about. And on the other hand, I still had the creative bit intact. And I meet a lot of people who say, oh, no, I've got this great idea and I can do all of this stuff, but, the money, I can't deal with that. And I always say, you can learn that. You can learn any of these things. In this day and age, I learned I learned to do online accounting when I first started out. I learned CAD drawing. I learned reading legal contracts. You can learn anything in this day. Well, and for the most part, do it yourself without paying great, accountancy skills, great, professional skills. And indeed, with AI, we can all be super, really.
I recall selling my first business, and we sold to one of our suppliers, who were a huge, big company that pretty much bought us and then just absorbed us into their business. And naivety is a wonderful thing. I'll never forget them saying, Jay, the legal costs around selling a business is quite significant. We have an in-house legal team. Would you like us to be able to take care of that for you? And in my stupor, I just said, well, that would be really helpful. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you for being so generous.
Thanks for saving me so much fees. And sure enough, this contract came through, and you read through it, and it's incredibly in-depth and complex and this and the other type of stuff. There was 50 or 60 pages to be able to script. And I read through everything, and there was so much in there that I hadn't considered that was included that I didn't stop to then subsequently get independent advice to say, and what have they left out? And it was those little nuances that, a year afterwards, when I was subsequently being chased for not having claimed any form of entrepreneur's relief for tax on income that I should never have had to pay in the first place, that you start to realize that the importance of learning it yourself, but then double checking it with somebody else just to be able to make sure that you've not gone down a bum steer, is just as critically important. And like you say, these days AI is there to be able to aid and support in the early days also.
Yeah, I mean, if somebody who's thinking of starting a business or early stage of business, if all they get out of this podcast today is exactly what you've described, because what contracts and selling the company and all sorts of contracts do is they imagine the future. And they try to imagine every single little thing that could happen and then protect you against that. And a good lawyer can do it, but you cannot rely on a good lawyer because they've got 20 other jobs they're doing. And good lawyers are good. They're very, very thorough and they've done it before, have a lot of experience. But being able to actually understand and pick every single detail. I can't say I'm great at it now, and I got people who do it more, but at the time I absolutely could do that, and I understood that process. And as I say, whatever you say you can't do, you actually can.
Yeah.
And it's just like when you have a pile of things to do and you keep putting off doing them, but actually when you do them, you suddenly find that actually you can go through the pile really quickly. It's just the mind block that stops you from getting started.
Amen. Simon, I genuinely believe that, certainly for myself and no doubt for many others, that your particular approach with Yo, and not just Yo Sushi, but then Yo Hotel and Yo Home and the whole plethora of different areas in which you've now expanded into, has helped shape the public perception of what entrepreneurship not just is, but can be with regards to your disruptive approach. As I mentioned in the intro, you were one of the original dragons back in 2005, but I do recognise that you chose not to stay as part of the team for long. It's recorded that you said that you were unhappy with the way that some entrepreneurs were treated through that process. I wonder if you're willing to share just a little about, one, the concept of Dragon's Den, and then particularly your experience of it.
Well, it was very exciting doing Dragon's Den. I very nearly didn't do Dragon's Den because I just made my first sale of part of Yo Sushi and I had a bit of money. And I thought, I'm not going to go on TV and give it away to other people. BBC aren't the best people at sourcing great business ideas. So, but then everybody talked about it. I'm Duncan Banter. So, you're mad turning that one down. It's going to be so good. And I thought, I kicked myself. How could I have done that? Turned it down. And then they called me and said, look, one of the dragons on the pilot doesn't cut the mustard. Would you reconsider? And I said, step this way, no problem. So that's how I got onto it. And what's the Alan Sugar one called?
Apprentice.
Apprentice, and that was out. And, love them or hate them. I think for kids growing up in school and watching TV, all of those things were fantastic because there was a sort of sense in a lot of them as I could do better than that. They're not that clever, those guys. Business is not that complicated. So I think it gave an opportunity and it made it very, very accessible to people. I did, being me certainly me at that time. It was the BBC's show, not mine. But I did say, look, we should be following. We. I was a guest artist, if you like. We should be following people trying to get businesses that are good and trying to get successes. And really, certainly at the outset, they wanted it to be X Factor and to the judges to kind of really knock things down and all of that. And I was always known as the nice dragon. So I probably burnt my bridges a little bit there. But I think they also wanted, probably quite rightly, to have lots of different dragons and to change things as they went along. But the thing everybody says to me, what was it like being a dragon? I said, the thing you've got to remember about if you get to pitch something on Dragon's Den is there's not 5 dragons there sitting, is this going to be a great investment for me? There's 5 dragons sitting there. So I wonder what you think of my performance. It is a show, and the BBC probably aren't the best people for finding good prospects for great investments. So that there's that. I remember calling them all up soon after it came out. It was a big hit very, very quickly, Dragon's Den. And I called them all up, and I remember Peter saying, what do you think of my performance? And Rachel says, I got problems and this and that. And I got to Duncan Banton and I said, what do you think, Duncan? And he said, Simon, he said, it's what I've always dreamt of. He said, they recognize me on the street. And he said, I fucking love it. There's a bit of all of that. But yeah, I think it's a force for good, all of that stuff. It just makes, we live in an insecure world. There's no longer a job for life as there was when I sort of was young, or probably when your dad was there working in his warehouse. There's no longer that. So it's an insecure world. So being an entrepreneur and doing your own thing is probably not such a stupid thing to do, as the careers master at my school would have said years and years ago. It's probably just as secure as having a business. And the thing is that if you do start a business and it goes wrong, especially when you're younger, you've learned a lot. I often think that, and venture capitalists say this, that people who've had failures are often very investable because they know not to go too close to the edge and they know what can go wrong.
Yeah. It's ironic. I mean, you mentioned Duncan Bannatyne particularly. I spent 12 years in uniform, Queen and Country in the army, and then unfortunately an accident in the Gulf determined I was medically discharged in 2000. I spent a couple of years in hospital being put back together again and this and the other type of stuff, and finally became a civilian in 2002. And my nan, pretty much my surrogate mum, watched the first ever episode of Dragon's Den, and then called me up and said, I've bought you a Christmas present and a birthday present combined, because it was quite a lot of money, but you've got to come home and see me before Christmas or your birthday, because it expires before both. And it was an audience with Duncan Bannatyne. And she said, this guy's done all right for himself. You should go and listen. And it was fascinating. There were 50 people in the room. We spent a whole day with Duncan and some of his management team up in one of his hotels in Newcastle. And whilst I was, it was long before I'd even considered owning my own business, but spending time with both Duncan Bannatyne and his management team, but 49 other people that had spent time to be there, and the collaboration of thoughts and ideas and suggestions, that ignition of something that said, oh, wow, oh. And, we're now 20 odd years on. And I'm still in contact with some of the people that I met in that room that day. And I still call them up and say, I was just thinking about doing this. And so the relationships that built off the back of a connection are as important.
I think, yeah, absolutely. I think the power of that sort of network, funnily enough, I'm thinking of doing a similar thing in my sort of mentoring capacity. You know, it's not that I can tell anybody what to do. I can only tell people what happened to me and what I learned along the way. But I think that feeling that you got then of I'm in this and actually people are taking me seriously, and that, you know, to build confidence like that. And of course, Duncan, you were discharged from the army for some form of a disabled thing or whatever it was. But Duncan was discharged because he threw the commanding officer overboard, which is a great story. But you can imagine the sort of, you know, young guy he threw over. But, you know, very Duncan and
absolutely.
You know,
I didn't realise how big he was. He's quite a towering man. That if he speaks, you certainly listen.
That's right.
Simon, you sold, or at least a controlling stake in Yo Sushi back in 2003 now. You started to step away from the day-to-day operations as such. What was that transition like of handing the reins over of something that you built from scratch? Was it always the plan to do that, or what prompted you to do it at that time?
All right, so it's a very, very pertinent question. I mean, and looking back, I ran Yo Sushi in 1997, 2003, was it? So that's 5 years. I always thought it was 4 years, and I ran the whole shebang. And we were up to 4 restaurants. So we had Poland Street and Harvey Nichols and Selfridges and one in Finchley Road. And you know, I always think that during the early phase of a business, whether that's 1 or 2 or 3 years or whatever it is, being a megalomaniac control freak is a very, very good way to get something going if you've got the money to do it. You know, because it's why entrepreneurs can do things rather than if you're a big company, you'd have a big whiteboard and you'd put it up for general discussion and all the ideas would get knocked down because there's always a reason not to do something. But if you have a gut feeling and you want to do it just because you want to see what it looks like, which is what my motivation was really, and to survive, it's a different matter. So, you know, megalomaniac control. But then once something is up and running, to be able to hand it over. And Robin Rowland had come in as a operations director to work for me. He'd come from Whitbread, and he was very ambitious, and he had never been a CEO. And I thought to myself, actually, he's really good. You know, he was difficult, but he was really good. And I thought, I'm going to hand it over to him. And people said, you'll never do it. You're a maniac controller. And I love surprising people. So I shut my door and I said, you run it. You run it. He said, you're very inspiring. I could never have done what you did, but sometimes you lose it on stuff. You know, if there was one thing wrong in one of our restaurants, I'd have to do deep breathing exercises and walking around the block 3 times because I thought nobody would ever come back. Whereas he made a list. He is an operator. And I always say you have to have an entrepreneur and an operator, and an operator can actually systemize things. And that's what he did. And he was the first person to really build out Yo, and it's now in other hands. But that's what happened, and that is the right thing to do. And it gave me the opportunity to do the next thing, which was, well, first of all, it was going into licensing. We did all sorts of things in a clothing range and this, that, and the other. But the next big one was Yotel, and we got that off the ground as well. We did.
Sorry, go on.
No, I was. There's a song. I don't know what it is. It goes, "We did it again," and that always comes into my mind.
I was going to say, since Yo Sushi, you've gone on to create Yotel and then Yo Home and other ventures that collectively continually challenge conventional thinking. Yo Sushi broke the new ground by introducing conveyor belt dining into the UK and novelty for British restaurants. Yotel disrupts hospitality with compact, futuristic hotel rooms. And then Yo Home reimagines urban living with transformational apartment spaces. a while ago now, probably 12, 13 years ago, I went to the States and qualified as a blue ocean strategist, looking at disruptive pattern thinking. And I've always admired the way that Yo disrupts traditional industries. Whilst it perfectly hits the find your niche mantra, was it always that drove you, or was there something more personal that within you that said we've got to break the mold?
Well, I suppose getting attention. Yeah, I don't know. What was I going to say? Yeah, I can't remember how I was going to approach it. Yeah, if I'd done market research and said, would you like to eat raw fish off conveyor belts with robots serving the drinks, I don't think many people would have put their hands up. And by the same token, when we opened your hotel, if I said, would you like to sleep in a 7 square meter room with no natural light, the windows looked out in the corridors, people aren't going to put their hand up. When people walked in, they said what I call the magic words. And the magic words are, this is so obvious. Why didn't somebody do this before? And that, I think, is what I think about that question. Is you've got to, and so out of that became a brand that wasn't invented in an advertising agency, that just was invented out of my experience really. There were lots of people in the footsteps of Richard Branson who wanted to do cheeky, innovative brands doing different things. And I think our version of the cheeky, new, disrespectful of the old a little bit brand that customers were drawn to and loved was innovation, and we called it can I constant and never-ending innovation. And so I always wanted to be able to open something, and I wanted people to say, you have got to see what they've done now, you've got to go and have a look at this, because word of mouth, whether it was word of mouth in the old days or Instagram or whatever it is, that is the greatest advertising of all. And I never, we got a lot of TV because it was very televisual, and I'd been in show business, and I never talked about how great the ambience was or how good the food was or the service, because I know that anybody's going to say that about a restaurant or a hotel. And so at some instinctive level, people aren't going to believe it. They're going to say, everybody's going to say that. So I talked about the world and life and everything according to me, as I'm doing to you. And it got lots of mileage. And we had, some fantastic headlines like Sayonara McDonald's and Fast Forward. We just fabulous press we had, because it was fun and it was different.
It's interesting. You've just mentioned that constant and never-ending innovation, that can I concept. Interestingly, episode 32, 33, I think it was, I had the pleasure of being able to interview property mogul Rob Moore, who's done 500-700 million pound in property in Doncaster and across South Yorkshire as such. And he used the same term and phrase. He talked about a never-ending innovation and the needs to constantly, it's almost the Kaizen philosophy of incremental improvement all the time, and not relying on what you've got, but saying, and now what do we do next? I wonder if he's pinched it from you or learnt it from... It
was actually originally, I think the first person I heard it from, that thing was not constant, never-ending innovation, but constant improvement. And that was the amazing public speaker, Anthony Robbins in America. He used to use that in his massive action and all that stuff that he did.
If I may, I just want to go personal for just one question, if I may. I've openly shared that although I had a physical accident in the Gulf, I went on to be diagnosed with complex PTSD from the Gulf and was finally discharged with PTSD. It's something that I continually manage in order to be able to make sure that it doesn't have an ongoing impact on me. And then earlier in the series, I think it was episode 48, we interviewed Gerald Bratner, not only about his IOD faux pas, but about the years that post faux pas, if you like, and his time with fighting with depression and challenges over some of the decisions he'd made and the impact it had. Simon, you mentioned earlier today in this interview about, earlier in the 1990s going through some challenging times and some depression. I wonder if you've got any points to share with people with regards to if things aren't going quite so well as you would have hoped right now, how to be able to change the dialogue in order to not allow it to swallow our thinking or our abilities to be innovative.
Yeah. No, when you're in the hole, it's hard to get out. And I'm sure there'll be people listening today who can relate to that. You can, first of all, you can go to the trouble is that, as my understanding for sort of clinical psychology, is that when you get down about something, and often it's a very good reason, you're running out of money, or your boyfriend or your girlfriend's left you, or whatever it is, your parents are difficult. If you allow that to go on for too long, the brain takes it and makes it into chemistry, which it becomes clinical depression. So, the quicker you stop that stuff, the better. And one of the things I've learned is that life is difficult. That is such a great realization that, I never promised you a rose garden. It's difficult, and it's difficult for pretty much everybody, I would say, at different times. And, I always had this image of a sort of comfort zone, that if you're in your comfort zone, and you can be depressed and at home doing nothing, or, not getting under the bedclothes, and it's sort of a comfortable place in a way because you're not challenging yourself. But actually, you've got to step outside that comfort zone. And I think that's what successful people do, or anybody who gets out. You've got to do the things that actually don't feel comfortable, whether that's physical exercise or challenging yourself to go out and see people or make mistakes. You've got to go do that. And actually what happens when you step outside the comfort zone, like the pebble dropped into the water, the ripples go out and your comfort zone gets bigger. And as you do that, and we hear a lot about you've got to fail, but I think you have to have an image of what that actually means to you. It's all very well saying love yourself or fail more or whatever they are, but you've got to get a practical way of what that really means to you. And I think that's what I did. I've been off games for a while because I had a bad leg, and I actually went running today. I just did a couple of kilometers. And it was bloody hard. It really was hard, but I felt so good after it. And I'm not saying to exercise everything, but it is a metaphor for doing difficult things in your life and being willing to fail and realize. And I suppose they call it shame these days, or embarrassment that I'm not really up to that. But actually, it's ordinary people like you and me who can do really difficult things and really big things like I've done. And when I was growing up, I always thought they were always special people, but not like you and me. And actually, it's the other way around. It's actually, so if your listeners are, feeling a bit less than, a bit chippy, a bit angry with the world, bully for you, that can be really useful, especially the angry bit. You can get out, it gets you doing things.
Yeah,
so
use it as a fuel. Yeah,
use it as a tool to say, damn it, I don't give a damn, I'm just gonna go for it. And it's amazing what happens when you put yourself out there.
It's interesting. I've got my whiteboards on the wall behind my screen, so I can constantly have them in view. And the big sign that is written across the top, it's been there for the last 6 or 7 years. It simply says, "This too shall pass." And it doesn't matter whether you're celebrating having just won a new client or a new contract or this and the other type of stuff, and you've got into this euphoric, oh, I can do anything type moment, or whether you're scrabbling around going, oh my God, I've got the bills to pay and the salaries to pay and where's the money going to come from and this and the other. If you just remind yourself that I'm 53 at the moment, and I've got 53 years life experience of getting to where I am today. Whatever you're facing right now, it's never going to be forever. This too shall pass.
Yeah, no, very, very good. 53 is an interesting age. I always think back, I was 55 was the year that I realized you didn't live forever. And that was and the earlier you get that, the better, that is carpe diem. It's do it and do it now.
Amen to that.
Yeah. No,
Amen to that.
they're very good. Those things that you know, those little words or those sayings. I have always had lots of them in my mind. You know, whether it be "fuck it, let's do it," "screw it, let's do it," or whatever they are.
Just like little prompts, just to be able to keep you on track.
Recognize what is going on in your mind.
This is probably a nice segue into my penultimate question, if I may. I first learned of John Timpson from Timpson's Cobblers, if you like, ethos, during the period where I ran my first business when I first left the military. And his ethos inspired me to be able to recruit my first ever ex-offender, a guy called Derek, who came in to be a driver for the business. He was just phenomenal. I wish I could have had far more Dereks than I had other members of staff. Since then, I've had the pleasure of being able to attend the same church as John here in Manchester and listens to both him and James talking about the mission and values of Timpson's. Now, I know that you also support both prison reform and vocational training with inmates. I was intrigued to understand a little bit about what drives your interest in this particular social impact, and perhaps how entrepreneurship can be the segue for people to be able to have a second chance.
Well, absolutely. No, I'm a big fan of The Simpsons. Very simple. My interest in prisons is I was in one when I was 19. I left school. I went to Cambridge Tech to do A levels. I didn't. I sold a bit of hash to some friends I was made an example of, and I went to North Sea Camp, which was the prison camp, which is a detention centre. And it taught me a lot of lessons, but one of them was the absolute, terror and fear of having your liberty taken away. And also that so many of those kids who were in there, but for the grace of God, would have gone, you, me, and anyone listening, if we had had a lot of the backgrounds that they had. And absolutely right that you have to punish, but you have to, once you get people, you have to rehabilitate. And that's what James Timpson is trying to do. He's minister for prisons at the moment. Very difficult to change that, and not least because you've got to change the public's point of view, which generally has always been throw away the key. So if I get the chance to stand up and speak out on that, and I have talked about lots of things. I've got caught up on some of things of my own just in the last year, but I wanted to do a model prison to actually, because I think the best way to do new things in this world is to make prototypes. When we launched the hotel, I built a prototype, a complete full-scale prototype, and exhibited it before we'd even got a hotel site. People said, oh, somebody's going to nick the idea. Of course they're not going to nick the idea. They've got their own ideas. And people walked in and said, I want one of these at home. Where can I get one of these? So we got that in the headlines early on. And I'd love to do a model prison of some sort, or a model something like that and I think there's a lot of initiatives going on, and I think it will change. And I think that is the way to bring, it's one of the ways to bring down crime, is to and if we're going to really go political and further into it, education really is the thing. There's so much pressure on parents at the moment to survive and to make money for their kids, that until we actually change the education system, and that is already changing. In Scandinavia, teachers have the same status as doctors. And I think that's what we have to do, and to put our money not into the length of a government, to the Labour Party or the curriculum, but in over a longer period of time, 10, 15, 20 years. And I think that modern technology will have a lot to do with teaching people how to learn. And the balance. I hear a lot of talk at the moment in education about emotional intelligence, EI, and to teach kids, as well as reading, writing, arithmetic, which is you've got to learn in school. The rest, history, geography, the rest is going to be instantly available in this modern world. But if you can, reading, writing, arithmetic, if you teach at the same level how to be a better human being, how to interact, how to deal with feelings of anger and jealousy and all these things, then you're going to get great kids coming out and a great future for the culture of the United Kingdom or a lot of the Western things, a bit like they have in Thailand here. They examine kids here at school till they're 10, and the kids in a Thailand school they clean the school before they start work every single day.
Wow.
Work together. Amazing.
Wow. I often speak in schools, usually at around GCSE type time. And I'm a advocate and ambassador for the United Nations 17 Global Goals. And I'll often say to people, just out of curiosity, I says, just put your hand up if you've got absolute certainty as to what you want to do next, either A levels or or MVQs or City and Guilds, or where do you want to be? What does aspiration look like? Who's got a clear understanding? And probably about 7 or 8% of the population in the assembly hall will put the hand up and say, oh yes, I'm going to be an accountant, or I'm going to be a doctor, or I'm going to follow my dad into business, or whatever else. And that's great. Just out of interest, put your hand up if you've got a few ideas, but you're not quite sure which one of them you're going to go to. You probably see 20-25%. But because of GCSEs and where they are in life, if you like, put your hand up if you haven't got a clue and you still enjoy being a kid and you haven't given it any consideration whatsoever. And probably about 40% will put the hand up. I'll then joke with them and say, isn't it interesting that the teachers haven't put their hands up at all? They haven't got a clue whatsoever. And then I'll just put this slide up of the 17 global goals. And I say, these are the 17 problems that are challenging humanity for the next generation. And it doesn't really matter as to what profession you have. If you can help contribute towards one of those, you'll be forever in work and enjoying every day of your life. So don't hang yourself up on the identity or the title that you've got. Hang more on how do you contribute to a better society, and then understand as to how best can you be as an individual to make that contribution. What skills and experience do you need to be a better human? Yeah.
Exactly what I'm talking about. And actually, I've just written down 17 global goals because I have heard of it, but I'm not familiar with it. So you've influenced me on that. I think that kids in school, that's where the future lies, and that's going to be great.
I was actually over in Thailand in February interviewing a client of mine who was semi-retired out there. Episode 70, I went out to Chiang Mai to go and visit Steve Carr and to talk to him about mental health in the workplace and the decisions to leave the UK and the stress that he felt under and take his business digital and then live in Thailand, which is obviously not necessarily just around the corner, but certainly in the same country as yourself now. I'm intrigued, since you've been in Thailand, Simon, and you've seen a different way of life and a different way of being as such. Is that in any way influencing your current thinking with regards to entrepreneurship and looking at things from a different lens?
Yeah, very, very much so. Yeah, it's there's the whole thing there. But if you're out of the country, it's like when you go on holiday and you can actually see your life a bit better when you actually relax and see it. But Thailand, along with Bali, which are both Buddhist countries, have an exemplary culture of helping each other and being really, really good people. And they don't rely on government. I mean, government actually are pretty good here. Although it's a military influenced government, they're pretty decent people, and it's a rich country. But the culture going back, people, you just surprise you. I had to really relearn how to drive and never cut in because people are generous to each other. And that thing that you hear, oh, that's different. It's business. It's human nature. We're just like that. It's not. I can tell you, it's not. It's not. People are fundamentally good and can be. But if you live in a culture where that is encouraged, it's much easier to be a better person.
Amen to that. So it's interesting. I was in Bali literally weeks before lockdown in 2000. I think we'd flown back into the UK about 7 or 8 weeks before lockdown came in. And earlier this year, I was back out in Thailand. And both countries to which you've referenced, for me, are I almost get a recharge. I'll go over for a holiday, but you come back and it's a lot more than having just spent some time away from home and your desk. Going into a different environment, into a different culture, certainly makes you come back more appreciative, more acknowledging, more recognizing of your own faults and failures and things that you need to almost go back and check up on and polish up on.
So true.
Simon, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on as our 100th episode today. Thank you so much for giving your time and your insight, to which I'm sure all of our listeners will have made copious amounts of notes. I'll make sure that there's links to both your book and Yo Sushi and Yo website in order for people to be able to look and learn a little bit more about you and what you're doing these days. I always end on the same question whenever I've got a guest, and it's quite simply, what's the one thing that I haven't asked that I really should have done, that you could perhaps share a final word of wisdom with us?
Oh, what haven't you asked? I think you've been very thorough. I suppose you could ask, what's it like getting older? And I own up, I'm 74 next year.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And the thing that surprised me about getting older is it's exactly the same. You know, you hear a lot of people say, oh, you feel younger than you are, but it's your body and all of that. And that's all right. And I think that rather than, and then I always thought when I got older, I'd keep all the photographs so I could look back and reminisce on all the things I did. And I don't. I really don't. Tomorrow's another day, and I go on the premise of the best is yet to come. So always trying to look forward. But I think that, when I eventually move on, wherever that is, that I'll say not I had a great life or I did this or I did that, but this is the person that I became. And I think that is the thing, because I've been edgy from time to time, but I think I've become a better person. That's as good as it gets.
Amen to that. I can't say I've ever interviewed Tony Robbins, but I was fortunate enough to have gone to one Unleash the Power Within and then do Business Mastermind with him. And there's a particular question that Tony asks within Mastermind, and he says, I just want you to imagine for a moment that you know that today is your last day on earth, that you're currently laying on your deathbed, and you know that you've reached whatever age it is, and that there's a sense within you that this is towards the end. He said, I'm just intrigued, will you be smiling or will you have a frown? Will you be smiling with all of your family around you, knowing that you've lived a full and good life and left the world a better place than it was beforehand? Or are you frowning and saying, I wish I'd done more with my time?
I asked my Thai wife, who I married quite recently, what she would do. She said, well, what would you do? And I said, well, I'd like to be with you. I'd just like to hang out, just the two of us, and be with you. And I said, what about you? And she said, no, I'll be all right on my own. And I thought that was a very good answer. Come in on your own. I'm okay on your own. I'm comfortable with myself.
Amen to that. Amen. Simon, thank you so much for giving your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm sure that the listeners will have taken much from it. God bless you. Thank you. I've
really enjoyed it as well, Jay, and hearing your things as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
That's all for this episode. As always, we really thank you for listening and welcome your comments, thoughts, and suggestions. So please do drop us a line by emailing podcast@mytruenorth.biz. And don't forget, if you haven't already done so, hit the subscribe button on whichever platform you're listening to this through. And tell your colleagues and business network all about who we are. You've been listening to the Add a Zero podcast, presented by Jay Allen. Brought to you in association with TrueNORTH, the UK's leading ethical coaching company.